Standing at over 5 feet tall, with a wingspan of over 7 feet, and weighing in at nearly 16 pounds, whooping cranes are the largest flying birds in North America. Named after their resonant, deep, chortling call, they are at the same time one of the most endangered species and one of the most studied bird species of our time. The significance of the whooping crane story to endangered species recovery efforts cannot be overstated. Never very abundant, biologists estimate that before European settlement in North America, whooping cranes may have numbered about 15,000 or so. They were found across the continent, from the coastline of what is now northern Mexico to the prairies and tundra of northern Canada. Alarmingly, by the late 1800s, the number of whooping cranes had declined to fewer than 1,000 pairs due to hunting, egg collection, and habitat destruction. By 1941, the population had fallen to only 15 birds in the Texas population and only 6 whooping cranes in a non-migratory population in western Louisiana. Although no one knew where the remaining migratory whooping cranes nested, the value of Texas coastal marshes to these and other migratory waterfowl and wildlife was recognized. As a result, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established Aransas National Wildlife Refuge by executive order in 1937. With hunting and egg collection suppressed by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, and the protection of a substantial portion of their overwintering habitat at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, whooping crane numbers slowly recovered so that by the 1950s, there were 30 or 40 hoopers in the Aransas population. Surveys conducted by small plane and also ground-level reports documented that whooping cranes migrated from their coastal overwintering grounds to northern Canada in early spring, but their destination was unknown until, in 1954, there was a fire that was started in Wood Buffalo National Park, and Forestry and Wildlife Service personnel responding to that fire observed a pair of whooping cranes. The Wood Buffalo National Park was established in 1922 primarily to preserve habitat for the world's largest free-roaming herd of wood bison. The park is larger than Switzerland and is the second largest national park in the world. That underscores how fortunate one would have to be to locate the small number of whooping crane nests that existed at that time. 13 whooping cranes were spotted by responders to the 1954 fire, constituting over half of the 21 birds counted at Aransas the previous winter. Captive breeding programs, with the goal of restoring whooping crane populations to sustainable numbers, were begun in the late 1950s. Eggs were collected from a few of the known nests in Wood Buffalo National Park, and these were incubated at wildlife research centers in the United States. These collections were supplemented with chicks reared from the few captive whooping cranes in zoos at the time as well. The success of these programs, especially the effort to train whooping cranes to migrate from Wisconsin to Florida using ultralight aircraft, has been the subject of several documentaries. Progress with the captive breeding program faced many hurdles, but has proven successful overall and serves as a model for many species restoration efforts affecting other endangered or threatened species as well. Today, there are more than 500 whooping cranes that migrate 2,500 miles each year from Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas to Wood Buffalo National Park in northern Canada. In addition, resident populations have been reestablished in Louisiana and Florida, and a migratory population has been taught to fly from Wisconsin to Florida and is showing hopeful signs of sustainability. Before beginning a discussion of the life history of whooping cranes, I'd like to draw your attention to the work of Michael Forsberg and his recent book, Into Hooperland. Forsberg is a professional nature and wildlife photographer from Nebraska who has, better than anyone I believe, captured the struggle, the beauty, and the elegance of whooping cranes in the wild. He has visited their nesting grounds, overwintering grounds, and traveled with them along their migratory route, becoming familiar with some of the cranes on a first-name basis. In the images I took this past year at Aransas, one hooper stood out because of a leg band that was white over red over white. Forsberg knows that bird well, naming her Husker Red after his Nebraska heritage, and has a chapter in his recent book describing their relationship. I was excited to recognize Husker Red and learn just a little bit more about her through Forsberg's writing. On February 19, 2021, Forsberg describes in his journal seeing Husker Red on the Lamar Peninsula along St. Charles Bay, along with a mate. That's where I was in January as well. He spotted her again in 2023, but this time at her nest in Wood Buffalo. Other hooper crane watchers confirmed that her nesting efforts were successful that year as she and her mate returned to Aransas with a colt. I can hardly describe how exciting it was to photograph a hooper that was so well known to other photographers and conservationists. What I've learned about whooping cranes after several visits to Aransas National Wildlife Refuge is that they are incredibly beautiful and magnificent birds. Now, adult pairs, along with their yearling offspring, called colts, arrive at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in November after a migration journey that may have taken 3 to 5 weeks. Now, these yearling offspring are called colts because of their stride, the way they walk, which is reminiscent of how young horses move as well. Now, keep in mind that the colts would have hatched just a few months earlier in late April or May and would have been almost fully grown by September or October when they begin their migration journey of 2,500 miles or so. Whooping crane adults choose their lifetime mates by the time they are about 4 years of age. Each year, they return to the same general area in Wood Buffalo National Park to build their nests. Oftentimes, they will build their nest in an area not far from where they were reared. The invertebrates and seeds that hoopers feed upon are abundant in northern Canada in late spring when breeding pairs lay 1 to 3 eggs in their nests. The number of breeding pairs that successfully lay eggs varies from one year to the next, but often constitutes about 60% of the reproductive aged pairs that return to wood buffalo. Some of these birds can continue reproducing until they are upwards of 30 years old. Chicks appear after an incubation period of about 30 days and fledge after another 80 to 90 days. The chicks are able to walk about and feed on their own within a few hours of hatching, but stay with the parents for 9 months or more. Although each clutch may consist of 1 to 3 eggs, it's the first egg that is laid that typically produces the only chick that will survive. About 10% of adult pairs return to Aransas with twins, and typically about 3/4 of the colts that survive their first year will mature to adults. By September, the buff-colored colts are nearly the size of their parents and are ready to begin the migration journey from wood buffalo to Aransas. When they arrive at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, whooping crane families establish territories in about the same location each year. Defended by the male, these family territories may cover an area of almost a square mile. It's encouraging to see the successful recovery of whooping cranes from the brink of extinction, with a 35-fold increase in numbers in the Aransas population and the reestablishment of the Louisiana and Florida populations. But there are many threats to their long-term survival that will require human vigilance and intervention for some time to come. In addition to the lack of genetic diversity and relatively small numbers, the greatest threats to migrating whooping cranes are power lines, hunters, and predation. Other threats include climate change effects on habitat quality, loss of freshwater flows to coastal estuaries affecting the availability of foodstuff, extreme storms affecting bird survival and habitat quality, and also disease. For example, whooping cranes are particularly vulnerable to avian tuberculosis and other viral diseases that sandhill cranes are relatively resistant to. Privately funded research and recovery programs are filling the gap for now, but the lack of government support for these programs casts a shadow over what is undoubtedly one of the most visible and successful endangered species recovery efforts ever undertaken.